When we picture the end of the British Empire in India, it's super tempting to just view it as a single, neat, straightforward timeline. But the reality, it was actually way more like a bunch of pressure cookers all boiling over at the exact same time. Between 1940 and 1947, the subcontinent saw this absolutely unprecedented convergence of civilian uprisings, armed military struggles, and incredibly fierce diplomatic standoffs. So in today's Explainer, we're going to dive right into these converging forces, the precise, completely chaotic elements that finally shattered colonial rule.
And just to get our bearings, we aren't talking about isolated incidents spread out over decades here. Looking at this timeline, you can see we're focused on a really compressed 6-year window, absolutely packed with massive, parallel movements overlapping each other. I mean, while diplomats were arguing in conference rooms, civilians were literally protesting in the streets, underground radios were broadcasting in secret, and soldiers were marching on the borders. It was, for sure, a perfect storm.
To make sense of all this chaos, we're going to follow 5 distinct fronts: the Cripps mission, the Quit India movement, Bose and the INA, the naval mutiny of 1946, and finally, the endgame political negotiations.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the Cripps mission.
Let's start with the immense geopolitical pressure brought on by the Second World War. By early 1942, the Allies were taking really heavy losses, and Japanese forces were advancing super fast through Southeast Asia, basically right up to India's borders. Under serious pressure from the US and China, the British made this desperate diplomatic attempt. They sent Sir Stafford Cripps to India in March 1942 to secure Indian cooperation in the war effort. But honestly, his proposal fell incredibly short. It only offered dominion status after the war, and crucially, it contained a clause that kind of hinted at allowing provinces to opt out of a unified India. It was essentially planting the early seeds for partition. The Indian leadership rejected it outright. In fact, Jawaharlal Nehru noted that reading the draft proposals left him deeply depressed. This failure completely shattered whatever tiny bit of trust was left in British promises.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Quit India movement.
So with diplomacy dead in the water, public frustration just boiled right over. On August 8, 1942, Mahatma Gandhi delivered this legendary speech, famously declaring, "Do or die." And stop and think about the magnitude of that shift for a second. Gandhi, who had previously championed a very restricted individual satyagraha specifically to avoid paralyzing the British war effort, was now calling for immediate, massive defiance. He realized the British were just stalling. The demand wasn't for post-war promises anymore. It was for the British to completely and immediately pack up and leave India to its own fate.
Now, the very next morning, the British basically arrested the entire Congress leadership. But instead of crushing the movement, it completely ignited it. Just look at these numbers. By the end of 1943, over 91,000 people had been arrested. That is a massive scale. Leaderless civilians started targeting the symbols of colonial power, destroying hundreds of post offices and railway stations. And with the press totally gagged, Usha Mehta famously ran a secret underground radio station in Bombay. She was constantly moving the transmitter just to evade capture. Entire regions even set up parallel governments, like the Tamluk Jatiya Sarkar in Bengal, declaring themselves totally free from British rule.
And it wasn't just rural areas and political activists either. The civilian uprising paralyzed the absolute industrial backbone of the empire, and at the worst possible time for the British war effort. Workers at Tata Steel walked out and went on strike for 13 days. Textile workers in Ahmedabad halted production for over 3 months. And keep in mind, all of this was happening while the cost of living was skyrocketing and food was severely rationed. The economic damage to the empire was just staggering.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, Bose and the INA.
While the country was burning from the inside, a completely different threat was forming outside India's borders. Enter Subhash Chandra Bose. He believed that an armed struggle supported by Axis powers was literally the only way to evict the British. And his journey? It reads like a global espionage thriller. In January 1941, he escapes house arrest in Calcutta in the dead of night. From there, he travels through Kabul to the Soviet Union, eventually making his way to Berlin on an Italian passport, which is wild, and later takes a perilous submarine journey to Singapore by July 1943 to take command of the Indian resistance in Southeast Asia.
What he built over there was remarkable. In October 1943, Bose formed the Provisional Government of Free India. He took charge of the Indian National Army, or INA, which had actually been initially mobilized by Captain Mohan Singh, using around 40,000 Indian prisoners of war captured by the Japanese. Bose also created the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, which was a revolutionary all-women's military unit led by Dr. Lakshmi. This army actually marched right alongside Japanese forces toward Imphal, before eventually suffering a military defeat in late 1944.
But here's the thing, though they were defeated militarily, the INA achieved an absolutely massive psychological victory. After the war, the British made the monumental miscalculation of putting INA officers, guys like P.K. Sehgal, Shahnawaz Khan, and G.S. Dillon, on trial for treason at the Red Fort. And the result? Well, instead of setting an example, the trials sparked absolute national outrage. Across all political divides, Indians united to defend them. The pressure got so intense that the British commander-in-chief was literally forced to remit their sentences and release them.
Which brings us to Section 4, the Rhin Mutiny of 1946.
So those INA trials we just talked about, they proved the British could no longer rely on Indian soldiers to hold down the empire. In February 1946, on the HMIS Talwar, a sailor named B.C. Dutt wrote, "Quit India" on the side of the warship. The mutiny initially started over terrible food and blatant racial discrimination by British officers, but it immediately took on this really fierce anti-colonial, nationalistic character, heavily inspired by the INA trials that were dominating all the headlines at the time.
Within days, the strike just exploded. 20,000. That is how many sailors joined this mutiny, spreading across 78 ships and 20 shore establishments. They hoisted Congress, Muslim League, and Communist flags together on the ship masts. And they weren't alone in this. Massive civilian solidarity strikes erupted in Bombay and Calcutta, turning the cities into literal battlegrounds with barricades and street fighting. Though leaders eventually negotiated a surrender, the mutiny proved a completely fatal point. The colonial sword had officially turned against its master.
Let's move to our final front, Section 5, the final negotiations. Faced with uncontrollable uprisings and these massive mutinies, the British knew their time was basically up. Now, as early as 1944, diplomatic attempts were being made to untangle a deeply complex political knot. The Rajaji formula proposed a post-war plebiscite in Muslim-majority areas to address the demand for a separate state. Then, in 1945, the Viceroy Lord Wavell convened the Simla Conference. He proposed an executive council with equal representation for caste Hindus and Muslims. But this broke down over a really critical point of friction: who had the right to nominate Muslim members? The Muslim League claimed exclusive right, while the Congress insisted on its status as a secular representative of all Indians.
What we see in these final years is defined by a deep ideological deadlock. We have two major political factions with fundamentally incompatible visions. The Indian National Congress, represented by leaders like Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, staunchly demanded a completely independent, unified India. On the flip side, the Muslim League, under Muhammad Ali Jinnah, firmly anchored its position on the 1940 Lahore Resolution, demanding a sovereign separate state of Pakistan comprising Muslim-majority provinces in the east and northwest.
A final, really last-ditch attempt to keep the subcontinent together came with the Cabinet Mission in 1946. They proposed this complex, three-tier federal structure that gave significant autonomy to provinces without outright partition. While initially there seemed to be a fragile sort of acceptance, the agreement ultimately collapsed. The breakdown in trust led to immense communal violence. Realizing the situation was completely beyond repair, the British government sent Lord Mountbatten to oversee the rapid, final transfer of power, setting the very tragic stage for independence inextricably paired with partition.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a final thought. Independence wasn't just handed over neatly at a polished negotiating table. It was forced by an unstoppable convergence of forces. From the civilians braving bullets in 1942, to the INA soldiers marching through the jungles, to the naval sailors defying their commanders in 1946, each movement fed into the next, breaking down that colonial machinery piece by piece. So, how do we even begin to measure such immense, multi-layered sacrifices for freedom? It's a profound thought to take away with you today as you reflect on how history is actually shaped. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey through the converging forces of freedom.